Hello, and welcome to Baha'i Blogcast, with me, your host, Rainn Wilson. This is where I interview members of the Baha'i Faith and other friends from all over the world about their hearts and minds and souls, their spiritual journeys, what they're interested in, and what makes them tick. Enjoy. Hey, Baha'i Blogcast listeners. I am here with Dr. Derik Smith. Can I call you doctor?
Nah, you just call me Derik. That would be better.
You have a doctorate.
Sure, yeah.
See, he's too modest to even own that he's Dr. Derik Smith, but I will just refer to you as Derik Smith. You're a professor at Claremont McKenna, is that right?
That's right.
And what do you teach over there?
Well, my area is primarily African American cultural texts, so anything from poetry to film to music to novels. I mostly focus on representations of Blackness in literary texts, but then I kind of extend beyond to other kind of cultural texts, everything, including, cinematography and so forth.
Oh, so your course of study, when you say texts, that could be a film, it could be a TV show. Right. You could it's almost like kind of modern, like critical theory.
Exactly, right. So, for example, like right now, I'm teaching 2 sections of a course on representations of Blackness in Hollywood cinema. So that's one of my favorite courses to teach. I've been teaching that for a while. And then another one that I'm doing is on African American autobiography. So, as you said, cultural text, cultural theory coming into all elements of the study, basically.
Well, before we get into some of your writings and your areas of study, which are just fantastic, I've read some of your stuff, some of your critical essays, really, really exciting, cutting edge stuff. Bring us up to speed. Tell us about your background and how you got to be here. Did you grow up Baha'i?
Yeah, I did. My parents were both. They became Baha'is in the early 1970s. They were both in grad school at University of Michigan, and they met there. And shortly after I was born, and they were really, and still are, very committed Baha'is. So soon after I was born, they moved to the Virgin Islands, where I grew up. So I grew up on St. John in the U.S. Virgin Islands, and I grew up sort of in a very small Baha'i community in the Caribbean, but really involved in sort of what you might think of as the pioneers kind of life, like we used to travel to islands here and there all the time. And, just all the center of my parents' world was always sort of service to the faith and stuff. So I grew up, really ensconced in all of that.
Yeah. Can you give us some specific examples of growing up a pioneer kid? We have that in common. So I was a pioneer kid too.
Oh, I don't know.
Only in Nicaragua for about 3 years, but I came back when I was about 5. So when did you come back to the States?
I came back to go to college, so when I was 18.
Oh, okay. So you really like are U.S. Virgin Islands kind of.
Yeah, man. That's where I'm from, really. I could talk like this and everything, but just when I come to the States, I don't talk like, it's from the islands,
That's fantastic. But do you have any cool stories of going to like small islands and teaching the faith out there?
Sure. Like we would go to support Baha'i communities that were, let's say, like a boat ride away. We would get in a small boat and go from St. John over to this island that was actually part of the British Virgin Islands called Jost Van Dyke. And Jost Van Dyke was even smaller than St. John, which only had probably like 3,000 people on it when I was growing up. And we would go there, and there would be no electricity. They didn't have any electricity over there, and so we would take this kind of this little dinghy-like boat over there, and then we would sort of walk around the island. Probably, a couple hundred people maybe lived on that island, and so we kind of like look for the Baha'is that were over there, and try and share, prayers and activities and so forth. So that was the kind of thing that we did quite regularly. And then also maybe like travel, like in the summertime, like we would go to summer schools in like the different islands. So I would, I went to Barbuda and Antigua and stuff like that for summer school. It was a very sort of exciting and kind of like, I don't know, open kind of Baha'i experience in that there were many different small communities that were sort of in network with one another, but then operating sort of in their own little sort of sphere because of the separation of the ocean, And then we would sort of travel, from time to time.
And we're having this conversation just a couple of weeks after the devastation in the Bahamas. Did that hit the U.S. Virgin Islands at all, or not so much?
The most recent hurricane?
Yeah, Dorian.
No, that was just a sort of a tropical storm when it came through the Virgin Islands. Before, I think this is about 2 years ago now, we got hit pretty hard.
Was it Matthew?
I don't think it was Matthew. It was a woman.
Those names are crazy to keep track of.
Yeah, and when I was growing up, we had pretty memorable ones that I can remember. But it's almost like a cyclical kind of, I don't know, destruction and then sort of rebuilding, and then you hope that the destruction doesn't return so quickly. It seems to be happening more and more frequently. I don't know. It's hard for me to sort of really estimate that, but I mean, it just seems as though that cycle of destruction and then rebuilding and so forth, that's part of the Caribbean sort of experience, but that it's been happening more frequently, in recent years. Yeah,
with increasing devastation. So was that a culture shock for you to go from St. John's to college? Where did you go to? University of Michigan?
Michigan, yeah.
So you go from St. John's to Ann Arbor. Did that mess with your head at all? What was that like?
Well, I mean, I was really fortunate in that I went with my best friend, Sanga. We went up there together, so we kind of had one another, and then a friend of ours came up afterwards. So we had our little kind of, I don't know, crew, little connection. And I had also been to Michigan. I had also been up to the States, to Michigan, a few times in the summer and stayed with my father's family up there. So I was familiar with sort of stateside culture, but I was really excited to leave the little sort of island, and come up to the U.S. And that was a desire that I always had. I was so excited to sort of come into the real world, so to speak. That's what I felt like.
Was that a culture shock going from that Baha'i community to the Ann Arbor Baha'i community?
A little bit, because I think it was kind of cool for me because I got to, I got to interact with, there were more people my age, that was one of the things that growing up in such a small kind of context, the Baha'i community was relatively small, so I didn't really have so many Baha'i peers growing up, and so I got to experience a little bit more of that when I was in college, so that was a benefit to being there. But I was I had a good time in college. I wasn't sort of super involved in all kinds of activities, but I was always there. I would try to go to feast, and I was part of the Baha'i club and so forth. So I have good friends who I met, in college in the Baha'i context.
Yeah, right on. And then you went and did a youth year of service in the Holy Land after that.
That's right. And after my first year in college, I went over to Haifa, and I was there for 1 year. I met my wife, Narmeen, there, and I worked in the cleaning and maintenance office. Mm-hmm. So that was a real formative period in my life in terms of my relationship with faith. I spent a lot of time by myself when I was over there, like reading a lot. And so I would do my work and then come back to my little flat, and I read a lot.
What were you reading there?
I read things like, the Akdas, the Kitabi Gan, God Passes By, tablets of Baha'u'llah, tablets of Abdul Baha. I sort of really immersed myself in the writings for myself, because as I was growing up, it was more like this was my parents' thing, right. And I sort of, I knew a lot, from having been around activities and having been to children's classes and so forth. But that's where I had the intellectual capacity at that time to really delve into the writings for myself. Yeah. And so I read a lot and tried to come to a fuller understanding of this thing that I was involved in, and I was like devoting my whole year to. So it made sense to my mind to try and get a better grasp of it.
Yeah, I've spoken many times before about having a similar experience when I had left the Baha'i Faith for a long time, at least 10 years. And as I was coming back, what an incredible rush it was for me to dive into those books and read them. And I started with the Dawnbreakers and and dove into all the major texts. Because when you grow up a Baha'i youth, it's like, oh, it's the religion of your parents, and there's kind of eye rolling, and you know it's good for you, but you don't really undertake it. So that individual investigation of truth, of kind of doing the deep dive for yourself when you have a greater maturity, is, I think, seminal in the experience of every Baha'i youth. And I think a lot of Baha'i youth do themselves a big disservice by not taking that journey. I'm not saying leaving the faith journey. I'm talking about going to taking some real time to go deep into the texts and find out what speaks to you. So what spoke to you?
I think in addition to the books, obviously, sort of the foundational texts of the faith, the ones that provide us with Baha'u'llah's very expansive and sort of all-encompassing mystical and spiritual and social engagement with sort of our reality, I was also very moved by Shoghi Effendi's writings, because I had, I think, a capacity to sort of understand the way in which the drama of history, was really sort of being explained by Shoghi Effendi, I think, in a way that is quite unique in our writings, So, Shoghi Effendi's concepts that are laid out in things like the advent of divine justice and so forth, these ideas of the disintegration and integration in the forces of history that have been unfolding for the last couple hundred years. Those were helpful to me in sort of understanding where I stood, like in this kind of expanse of human history. So I think that, Shoghi Effendi's writings, they really spoke to me there. And then I was also like you said, reading the Dawnbreakers, I was kind of like really entranced by the drama, the sort of the dramatic representation of that history by Nabil and so forth. Like, I was really into that, and you kind of figure yourself, who am I? How do I sort of fit into this narrative? Like, you these are heroic figures, you would like to model yourself after some of the heroism that you see here. And here's our, I don't want to call it mythology, but here's our history, that sort of that great story that we can really identify with. So I liked that too, particularly when I was, teen years, coming into my 20s.
Nice. So you did that year, you met your wife, you went back to Michigan, and did that change the kind of the journey of your life?
Well, surely, yeah. Getting married to Narmi was a huge sort of pivot in my life, a wonderful one. And we set about, having a family really quickly. So my first son was born in 99. And so that was just about a year and a half after we got married. And so early on, I kind of felt this sort of responsibilities of adulthood and being a father and so forth. So that was kind of a very sudden sort of step into this real world, if you will. I didn't have that much of a, sort of adolescence, you know what I'm saying? Like, I felt like, I had a lot of responsibility pretty quickly. And so that was kind of why I sort of immediately went from college, into pursuing a PhD and trying to get that as quickly as possible. And so while I was in my grad program, that's where I sort of started to pursue a dissertation on Robert Hayden, who's one of the most significant Baha'i artists in the American 20th century, as I think of it, and one of the most important American poets of the 20th century. And so I started to work on his poetry, and it was through him that I got even a deeper understanding, I think, of the workings of history and a Baha'i sort of conception of where we are and the spiritual sort of ramifications of being a Baha'i at this moment in history, and also being black, And so that's what his poetry is all about. And so it was kind of like he was almost like another guide sort of in this journey of sort of understanding my own commitments, basically.
So I don't know a whole lot about Robert Hayden. I mean, I know the pictures of him because he's so distinctive looking with his glasses and his suits, very intense, and sometimes a beret and whatnot. I've read some of his poetry. It's super cool. I've read and heard just a little bit that he kind of, in some ways, was almost ostracized or left out by a lot of the conversations because he wasn't political in the way that a lot of African American poets were in the late 50s and 60s. But that's all I know. So I'm an ignoramus. And for people listening, I imagine a lot of people don't know anything about Robert Hayden. Can you fill us in?
Sure. So you know quite a lot, I would say, in terms of understanding like the general framework through which Hayden has been sort of interpreted by literary historians, right, as a kind of outsider figure who is not quite in alignment with the efflorescence of, let's say, radical militant Black aesthetics and politics of the late 1960s, early 1970s. So he was coming into his heyday as a writer at that time, and he had been sort of working very diligently sort of in honing his craft, you could say a traditionalist style of poetry, right? Very attentive to language, a kind of meticulous revising his work all the time, never satisfied, always wanted to get sort of like the precision of language was paramount for him, and yet also, you know, deeply committed to these ideas of human unity, right? At a time when there was a lot of chaos sort of in American society, and there was also sort of attendant with that chaos a kind of shift into a radical aesthetics, which really elevated sort of like Black vernacular language and wanted to sort of do away with, in some ways, sort of like the restrictions of the poetic tradition. And Hayden, being somewhat of a traditionalist, didn't really sort of mesh with these sort of younger generation of poets who was really sort of holding the fore at that time in terms of Black poetic production. And so there's always been this kind of way of looking at literary history that puts them sort of at odds with one another. And sort of what I tried to do in my book about Hayden is kind of like undo some of that kind of what I call like a Manichaean, like, you know, kind of like completely oppositionalist framework, and looking at Hayden and these militant Black writers as sort of engaging in a similar project of trying to figure out what's the right way for Black artists to engage with American culture in that really chaotic time. So instead of looking at them as kind of in contention, I'm trying to find out what's the underlying sort of ground upon which they agree, you know, and then looking at the ways in which sort of Hayden's Baha'i commitments resonate or then don't resonate with some of like the social and aesthetic agendas of like the more militant Black radicals who were prominent in his era.
How did he become a Baha'i, or how did he hear about it? Do you happen to remember?
His wife, Irma Hayden, sort of guided him to the faith. She cultivated her own sort of faith in Ann Arbor, in Michigan, and then he, you know, was more, let's say, judicious, cautious maybe in his study, but eventually he also sort of came to a really sort of robust embrace of the faith on all kinds of levels, you know, and then it became fully integrated into his art and life as well. But, you know, being a very private and, let's say, introspective kind of person, he wasn't deeply sort of involved in like Baha'i activities and so forth. It was he was more of a artist, and sort of his commitments to the faith are manifest in this kind of sort of arguably timeless art that he created.
That's interesting. That, you know, that sparks my thinking, because I talk to a lot of Baha'i artists, and they're always this kind of figuring out, how do I use my art to serve the faith? And, you know, I'm an artist. I'm not very good at being on committees. I'm not very good at like organizing an activity and renting a rec hall and creating an email list and whatnot, and that kind of dichotomy that exists. And I think that, you know, we all have our ways to serve.
Yeah, I mean, my feeling on that is I'm most effective when I'm kind of doing what I really appreciate and what I really enjoy doing, but also maintaining this kind of commitment to service, right? So I think like the sweet spot is kind of like finding what you're good at, and then also doing that so that it is of service to the faith, right? I mean, it seems to me that that's the kind of the balance which we should be seeking for, right? Because if you hate doing what you're doing for the faith, then you're not going to do it well, right? So it seems to me that we have to always be on the lookout for, oh, here's a moment, where, or an opportunity for me to really do what I love, but also make that sort of completely in service of the faith. I think that's powerful.
But at the same time, you were at the Holy Land mopping floors,
Right.
You weren't necessarily like writing dissertations or giving talks or lectures or writing.
Right. Well, I was young then, and it was important, I think, to discover things, right? I mean, I had to come into that ownership of the faith myself in a period where I wasn't doing what was fun or something like that. It was kind of I think of it as a more difficult kind of period, but it also afforded me then the opportunity to sort of do the monk-like thing where I sort of sequestered myself and did the reading, which was key for me.
Yeah. Did you have any spiritually transformative experiences when you were there at the Holy Land? Just going back a page or two.
Yeah, I mean, like I'm not the kind of person like, for example, my wife has dreams all the time, and
my wife has dreams too. I feel like I had this dream. She's like, I have these dreams. Abdul Baha came and blah blah blah.
Right,
exactly. I've never had a dream with Abdul Baha.
Yeah. I'm the same way. So I'm probably too sort of empirical, rational, kind of minded for some of that. But I had profound experiences where. And I remember being, I would pray a lot. Like I would go to the shrines and so forth and pray. And, I would walk in the gardens and so forth. And I remember one evening kind of like being behind the Shrine of the Bab, walking in the gardens and sort of realizing like, okay, if this is really what I think it is and really what I believe in, then I have to try to make it the totality of my life, and of course, that's very difficult to do. But I mean, I can remember that specific moment of being in these holy spaces and feeling like, okay, here's a pivot. Here's a sign for me. It came to me that I have to sort of try my best to live up to the ideals of the faith. So, I mean, that did happen to me while I was over there.
Let's go back to Robert Hayden a little bit. What's your book about him?
It's called Robert Hayden in Verse, New Histories of African American Poetry and the Black Arts Era.
Fantastic.
Long title.
It's a long title.
Subtitle, right.
You need to catch your title. Like
right.
Hayden Schmaden or something. I don't know.
Right.
I don't know. We'll work on that.
Okay.
That's great. And can people pick that up out there? Is it available somewhere?
Yeah, that's, you can get it online. All the University of Michigan Press, you get it from there. It's out there.
All right, cool. And what else can you tell us about his poetry?
So his poetry is complex and layered and very elusive, right? So one of the things that I would say, which is so impressive about him, is that you can read the poetry for years and then you can discover something that was put there by him that you never even saw before, right? And so, obviously I read these poems a lot and they sort of unfolded themselves after multiple readings, and I'm sure that I still haven't yet sort of really unlocked like all that's there, right? So he's such a sort of a sort of master of craft and illusion that these very dense poems sort of are, to use the simplistic analogy, like onions, there's many layers to them, and you can keep on peeling, right? And so his poetry is often known for its engagement with Black history, with African American history, and with the meaning of America, essentially. And so he has a lot of really sort of deeply contemplative poems about the difficulty of coming to terms with evil, in history, and also the evilness of American history. And this is one of his great, I think, contributions, is that he was sort of fully a believer in this ideal that we sometimes are reminded of in the Baha'i Faith, of the great destiny of America as a nation, and yet trying to reconcile that with the incredible sort of injustice that we find here. And so he was, always working through these kinds of tensions, right? So this destiny coupled with this reality, which is sort of not living up to the grand ideal of America, both as it's conceived in its own mythology and documents, but also the way that it is esteemed within the Baha'i Faith, as a kind of important nation in the unfolding of the revelation or the destiny of humanity as it conceived through the revelation of Baha'u'llah. So he was interested in that tension, but then also that more fundamental, you could say a fundamental tension of like the individual trying to believe in the possibility of a good universe and a future for humanity that was not defined by contention and oppression, trying to reconcile that with this great history of oppression, right?
Yeah.
So how do you sort of sit with both of those things at the same time, and the kind of
and how do you
well,
do you have any thoughts on this? So here we are in this great American democracy that was founded on blood and just the destruction of countless Native American indigenous tribes and an economy built on a slave trade. Yes, there's a lot of positive things about, democracy and freedom of speech, and there's ways that America broke ground in a lot of ways, but it's such a horrific history that needs to heal. And for America to achieve its great spiritual destiny, as Shoghi Effendi wrote about in Advent of Divine Justice, and Abdul Baha spoke about, how do we get there? I guess I'm just going to jump right into the deepest possible question.
Right. I mean, I think that for Hayden, who has taught me so much about sort of understanding this particular dilemma that you articulated, I think so cogently there. First of all, it sort of requires faith that it can be done, right? That we can overcome this history and that we can arrive at some greater destiny that lays in the future. We have to have faith in that. For Hayden and also for me, I think having that faith is extremely difficult, right? He suffered deeply, sort of emotionally, in his struggle to maintain faith, but also live with the difficulty of this history. So I think that first is the recognition of it's the real difficulty of it. Like, to be serious about it is not an easy thing, right? So I think that sort of continual confrontation. I think, though, that one of the things that I believe and that Hayden has taught me, I think, is like the necessary continual confrontation with the history, right? And unwillingness to sort of run from it or to turn away from it, right? Is that when we gain wisdom and strength and understanding when we deal with the history.
We look at it, we turn to it, we learn from it, confront it.
Yeah.
And confront ways where it continues to manifest today.
Right.
Because that history is not gone, it's not over with.
Right. I mean, there's a story that I often tell when I'm, in various things, when I'm dealing with my classes or doing a talk or something, about this time I lost my keys and it was really dark outside and I started looking for my keys and I was looking under this lamppost and all these people came to help me look for the keys under the lamppost. And then this one woman came up and she said, "Why are y'all looking for the keys here?" And I said, "Well, this is where the light is, so hopefully we can find it here." And she said, "Well, did you lose your keys here?" I said, "No, I lost it out in the darkness out there. But why would we want to look out there? There's no light, And so in order to, I use that as an analogy to understand, our sort of dealing with history and being willing to look at it in all of its dark forms in order to really understand how we can shape the keys that we need to open the doors into, a future that is perhaps more justice-filled and unifying than the one that we have now.
Fantastic. So I read an extraordinary essay that you wrote. I've read it like 3 times now. I passed it on to dozens of people. It's called Centering the Pupil of the Eye, Blackness, Modernity, and the Revelation of Baha'u'llah. And this was in the Journal for Baha'i Studies. Really fascinating exploration of this concept of the pupil of the eye. Can you tell us a little bit about it? And I have some more specific questions.
Okay. Well, first, thanks a lot for reading it and for passing it along. I really appreciate that. When I was writing the essay, I didn't really think so much about like how it might be received by a lot of people, but a lot of people have really expressed to me that they enjoyed or appreciated the writing, and I hadn't really thought about that so much when I was writing it because I was trying to work out almost for myself like a greater sort of personal understanding of this metaphorical concept that Baha'u'llah uses to describe people of African descent. And he says, Abdul Baha tells us that Baha'u'llah said that Black people are like the pupil of the eye through which the light of the spirit shineth forth. And so this is a pretty commonly understood and evoked phrase in Baha'i circles that think about Blackness and Black people. And so I was always sort of wondering, could I understand this a little bit more deeply? And so what I tried to do is make an argument about potential interpretations, right? Obviously, these are just my own thoughts, and these are some ways that I think I was inspired to think by the creative word, right? And so I came up with some historical interpretations of that that I thought would be sort of interesting and perhaps worthwhile for myself and then for other people as well. So do you want me to say a little bit about the argument?
Well, yeah, I grew up as a, goofy young Baha'i kid in suburban Seattle, and we certainly heard the pupil of the eye phrase. And, I always in my head just was like, oh, that's really sweet, or that's really nice that Abdul Baha used this phrase about African Americans considering their, horrific history in this country. And as I got older, I thought of it even a little bit deeper. I thought about that phrase as well. That shows that there's maybe a very special spiritual insight that people of color and African Americans have, maybe due to their heritage, maybe due to the suffering that they've undergone. But what you offer is an even deeper interpretation, which is there's a revolutionary act inherent in Baha'u'llah and Abdul Baha using that phrase in the 19th century that goes way beyond those two kind of insensitive and reductive kind of interpretations that I kind of had mulled over in my little head.
Well, I think one of the things that the essay tries to do is really engage with narratives of history, right? So our narratives of history are usually such that we marginalize Blackness, right? We sort of put the experience of Black people at the very periphery of our understanding of particularly Western history, and therefore you could say the history of the modern world, right? But in reality, like when we begin to sort of look at the work of really important historians of the last 100 years, particularly Black historians in the beginning of the 20th century, and now more recently, historians at the most prestigious institutions of learning in the world, one of the things that's becoming more clear is that Blackness was not at all, Black people were not at all at the periphery of the making of the modern world. In fact, Black people were at the very center of the modern world, right? So one of the most, I think, profound kinds of data points to help us understand that is the fact that from 1492 to 1776, right, there were 6.5 million people that came from the old world, meaning Europe and Africa, to the new world, the quote-unquote new world, meaning the Caribbean and the Americas. Now, 5.5 million of those 6.5 million were actually African, right? So this opening up of this new world, which eventually led to the great prosperity of Europe and eventually to America, North America, and to other parts of the modern world, was basically made possible through millions of lives that were committed to this work, right? Enslaved people who gave everything, of themselves to build this new world, which we enjoy today, all of us, right? So in a really profound sense, Blackness is at the center of modernity, of the modern world. And so I kind of thought about the pupil of the eye and the centering work that Baha'u'llah does with that metaphor as an instruction for understanding history. Actually, Baha'u'llah was telling us about the reality of human history, and if humanity is like a body, right? There's the body of humanity. Yeah. At its center is this pupil of this eye, which is one of the most important elements of our corporeal, reality. And Baha'u'llah puts Blackness at the center there because I'm thinking that Blackness was at the center of the modern world, which Baha'u'llah came to sort of revolutionize and transform. And then the other important thing to realize, right, is because of the really invaluable role that Black people played in kind of building this new modern civilization that we all benefit from today, and the way in which they were put to labor in such violent and expropriative means, right? They were enslaved in the most brutal kind of slavery that we know about in human history. There was a way that we had to justify that. Human beings had to justify that. And the justification came through ideologies of anti-Blackness, right? The only way that you can really do this to people is if you believe that they are so evil and so soulless and so, that you can sort of justify that, right? And so in the 19th century, the 18th century, the 19th century, when all of this is happening and Europe and North America is going through this period that is kind of called like the Great Leap Forward or the European divergence, right? All that is made possible by this Black labor, and so that Black people have to be degraded. And so in that 19th century, there's all these intellectuals who are helping to sort of advance this ideology of anti-Blackness, and Baha'u'llah comes along and says, in fact, no, it's not at all what you think, right? It's not that Black people have a lesser station, right, in this human family, but they actually have an elevated station. And I read that as a response to the incredibly destructive and divisive ideology of anti-Blackness. So if Baha'u'llah's revelation is all about bringing together all the world in unity and justice, how on earth is that possible when you have this special segment of humanity which has come in for incredible stigma? Right? And so Baha'u'llah's special elevation of Blackness is a response to and an antidote to anti-Blackness, which could only divide us. That's the only thing that it could really do. It could have no role in the world that is imagined and made possible through the system of his revelation. And so inherent to that system, in its kind of grand dimensions, there is this one facet which directly deals with anti-Blackness, because that precludes the kind of eventual unity that we must achieve.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? That first of all, it's no accident that it's the eye, and it's how light comes in the eye, and how we perceive the world. So, like you said, like maybe the most important part of the body. It allows us to interact with our environment. It's the discerner that this, if we're seeking world unity, the Black perspective, African American as well, is not just a good idea, or not just kind of like, hey, let's join arm in arm, but it's vital. It's necessary. We can't do it without the Black perspective and the African American perspective. Right,
exactly. We are all human beings, right? You can't degrade and relegate to a secondary status one segment of humanity if we are going to realize that vision of, human civilization that Baha'u'llah lays out, right? So the Black perspective must be incorporated just as importantly as any other perspective, right? Not that it is a kind of, in my opinion, any more important than any other perspective, right? but it has been historically so degraded and so relegated to a secondary status that it must be uplifted. We have to pay special attention to what Black people are saying, because if we don't, we're going to fall into the traps of anti-Blackness, which are so fundamental to Western modernity, which has become kind of global now.
Yeah.
And there's a subtle point that I'm trying to make, right? Because I believe that, race does not exist. Race is a construction of the human imagination, which was created to divide people and then exploit some people, right?
Okay.
So if we are all, in fact, human beings, right? Those of us who are marked by Blackness have to be recognized in all of our full humanity, right? And it's almost as though the only way to do that is to swing the pendulum toward a special recognition of Black humanity.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Because if we don't, we're just going to fall into that wiring which is so essential and fundamental to the building of the modern world, which is an anti-Black sort of sentiment and thinking.
And it feels to me, these are complicated times.
Yeah.
And you look at contemporary society, and especially like Twitter, and everyone's just yelling at each other and amplifying viewpoints that they believe in, and shouting down viewpoints they don't believe in. However, it seems to me there's been tremendous progress made in the last 5 or 10 years in a lot of ways. No, but because African American voices seem to be much stronger, and the white voices supporting them and their allies supporting them, that perspectives are changing, that the African American point of view about especially like cultural things is much more in the forefront, as far as I can tell now, than it was like 10 years ago. Would you agree?
Oh, definitely, right. And I think that you see that sort of maybe most simplistically, but also starkly, kind of like just in our entertainment, right? I mean, like the Black point of view, Black people are more central to our films and to our media that we consume today. And I think that that's, a good thing, right? Because what I believe is that it is through kind of like the multiplicity of perspectives and understanding and effort to reconcile this multiplicity of understanding that we come to the most kind of beneficial understanding.
Yeah, and that's unity
right?
and diversity. So,
Right.
Diversity, again, not just a good idea, not just, we can tolerate diversity, but, diversity as a spiritual thing to uphold, to celebrate it, encourage it, bring it on, and know that we're at our strongest as a race, as 7 billion of us on this planet, with maximum diversity and celebration of that diversity. And that's such a key component to the Baha'i Faith.
Right. And so I think that, our cultural products, our possibilities for living in this world are enhanced, right, when we bring in this Black perspective, which has been for so long, so degraded and relegated to a marginal status, right? And so I would agree, we are much advanced, from where we were only maybe 10 years ago. However, of course, that doesn't sort of negate the real
work we have yet to do.
Right, and the incredible fallout that anti-Blackness continues to produce in our, in our world and in America specifically.
Yeah. So a lot of our listeners are international and might be thinking right now, well, this is a uniquely American problem. But you see this kind of racism and the prejudice against people of color and darker peoples, like in every country of the world. So we do a lot of work in Haiti, and the prejudice that the Dominicans have against the Haitians is some of the most corrosive I've ever seen in my life. It's grotesque, and Haitian rights are, even Haitians that have lived there for 3 generations, their rights completely taken away from them. So how can you speak to these issues of prejudice and anti-Blackness and the healing of that and the pupil of the eye, from a global perspective?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I think that from what I'm hearing you saying, there's a couple of, issues. One is sort of like the economic regimes under which we sort of live today, right? A kind of what and many people call it sort of a neoliberal capitalism, which the great prosperity of the world today is not shared very widely. That, of course, then leads to divisiveness among those who don't have access to that great material wealth that is I think, part of that should redound to the benefit of all people in the world. And so that then leads to sort of fragmentation among groups and a kind of animosity between groups, which is then enhanced and sort of justified through these kinds of ideologies of anti-blackness that stem from ideals of white supremacy also. So, for example, the idea of, like in the Dominican Republic, where you have this kind of real animosity toward people of a darker complexion from Haiti, right? That's because of a sort of valorization and a fetishization of whiteness, right? And so these completely sort of made up categories of race have incredible consequence in that they make people shun blackness, right? And give undue kind of value to whiteness, right? And so that's not just happening here in the US, but particularly as Western culture and then through the conduit of American culture has spread throughout the world, right? We see that happening everywhere, right? Even places where there are no, black people or white people or very few, like places in Asia, right? You see that same kind of polarity existing where whiteness is held to be supreme and blackness is highly stigmatized.
Yeah, and it's also a tribalness and a hatred and a fear of the other, but it often is on kind of this color scale of the skin.
Right. It's become one of the most potent ways of differentiating ourselves, right? So there is that kind of inherent tribalism or that inherent sort of in-group favoritism and so forth, right? And that is something that has always been with humanity, but then it gets layered over in ideologies of race, which intensify it. And of course, we know that, the most destructive sort of periods in human history have been those driven by the ideology of race, in World War II and Nazism and in the sort of the making of the New World and the destruction of, Native people in the Americas and, in this sort of massive project of enslavement of African people.
So what do we do? Let's pretend right now there's some nice kind of liberal Baha'is listening and enjoying this conversation. And they're like, well, I love people of all races, African Americans, all different races. And I'm working to build a more just world community. But I'm here in my suburb of Pittsburgh or wherever they are. What do we do? What more can we do? What more should the Baha'i community be doing? What are ways that we can specifically step forward?
Well, I think again, the best guidelines are given to us in Shoghi Effendi, right? And I think it's sort of laid out there in the Advent of Divine Justice, where he basically says that, for white people and black people, there are these different ideals to which we must aspire, right? And for white people, it involves recognizing one's inherent sense of superiority, which Shoghi Effendi says is part of, let's say, the white experience in America. And sort of white Baha'is have to sort of confront that and be willing to kind of jettison that, leave that behind, and always sort of do that inner work which is necessary to recognize when that sense of superiority is operating, right? Black Baha'is, we need to be able to forgive the past. That's such a kind of difficult and aspirational ideal, but the ideals of the Baha'i Faith are quite aspirational and lofty. And so I think that Baha'is who are black, on the one hand, must be absolutely sort of conversant and recognize the history, that we come out of, yet at the same time, not hold that against the individual Baha'i, right? Any other individual, right? And we must be all forgiving. That's the aspiration of the.
That's tough.
Right, exactly. But this is like. Faith, if we think about faith, our faith coming out of Islam and Islam meaning submission, right? Like, this is what we're meant to do. We have to submit to those things which perhaps are most difficult for us to do. And it's only through that kind of deep commitment that I think we're going to make progress. The other thing is to recognize that it's not just interpersonal kind of interactions which are going to be really consequential. It's also the way in which racism has become kind of systematized and embedded in our institutions, and therefore we have to figure out what institutions are we involved in or adjacent to that we can address, right? How can we kind of address racism as it manifests in the institutions of our society, right? So we need to get involved and then bring these ideals which come out of the faith and which come out of our thinking and understanding of history into the institutions that bear upon our lives. And so I think that that's a kind of, you're talking about the suburban, Baha'i outside of Pittsburgh, it's like looking at the school district, like looking at the city of Pittsburgh, looking at the way in which law enforcement works there, looking at housing regimes, all that kind of stuff I think is where Baha'is need to sort of involve themselves, while at the same time kind of like engaging with, the core activities and the framework of the plan. Integrate all that together. I mean, I think that's the very high sort of aspiration that we have.
I was listening to this noted writer, Anand Giridharadas, and he was talking about, the best and simplest way to affect social justice immediately in our American world right now is to eliminate education being linked to property values. Just immediately. That's something that could happen just right now. We could just go to school districts around the country and not connect property values around the schools to their budgets. And that's one institutional way of changing things. But I think people don't understand that for an African American to go into a bank, to apply for a job, to go into a police station, to go into a school, to go into a hospital or be treated by a doctor, like there's a whole different set of standards. And institutionally, things are set up either, overtly or covertly or even subliminally to affect African Americans negatively. I think a lot of people don't know this. I've just kind of been learning about this over the last couple of years a little bit.
Yeah, I think, right. I mean, sometimes we talk about that experience with institutions of our society as being very much influenced by, biases and implicit biases, which are not really sort of cognizantly held by those who are expressing them, right? Mm-hmm. Because of the deep-seated nature of this kind of anti-Black ideology, which is also then compounded with an anti-poor ideology. When people that are marked by certain sort of markers of race and class status deal with institutions, they face very difficult circumstances, right? And we know, the statistics around the ways in which Black people are simply like not believed when they go to the doctor and they complain of pain, right? That then has these kinds of really negative impacts on health outcomes for Black people because their word is not taken as seriously, right? That addressing those kinds of things, involves training and almost like what we could call like a deprogramming and a kind of commitment to not dealing with people based upon this kind of, let's say, interpretive layer that is so marked by race and class and so forth. So there are various things that have to be done. I don't think my own position is that there is no sort of silver bullet or panacea, right, which we can immediately kind of apply to radically transform society. It does involve both the transformation of the inner self of every individual that then sort of operates in tandem with that outer social world. And so, yes, on the one hand, we have to sort of, let's say, clear out this kind of inventory of stigmas that are attached to certain people. We have to do that, each one of us ourselves, right? But then we also have to sort of figure out how then to sort of transform the institutions. I mean, my own feeling is that it's not difficult. It's not easy. If it was some quick fix, then we might be able to do it. But there's so many resistances, that it becomes very difficult. Yet at the same time, right? I mean, I feel like we have to be committed, right? I mean, it's that sort of same tension, right? It's like you're a pessimist of the intellect, but optimist of the will, right? This is the kind of quote from Gramsci, sort of social transformation theorist, right? That's what we have to have. And we have to work through those moments of pessimism with the belief that ultimately things can change. Like we have to have that kind of hope, I believe.
And why be a Baha'i? Why not just work with Black Lives Matter and social justice movements and the political left? What perspective does the Baha'i faith offer that might enrich or enhance those movements that are very strong today?
I mean, I think this is a really it's a very profound question. For me, it is a very sort of individually sort of, I answer it as completely as an individual, right? Mm-hmm. So it's my belief that Baha'u'llah speaks with divine authority. The revelation of the Baha'i Faith, the revelation that he brought, is one that integrates all elements of sort of the spiritual and social world in such a way that it can give us the possibility of divine civilization on earth, right? It is a comprehensive, sort of all-encompassing system. It's something that doesn't really have parallel in the human realm, right? So Baha'u'llah's ideals for social justice are intertwined with ideals for inner transformation, for example, right? And so I kind of feel that all of these sort of various causes that we have none of them can be solved individually. What people begin to understand as they become more and more involved in social justice work is that there is this great sort of there's this labyrinthine network that connects all sorts of institutions and powers, right? And so just the moment when you think you've sort of toppled the empire, right, the empire sort of pops up in another place, right? I mean, this is one of the things about sort of social theory of the contemporary world is that power, and let's say evil power in particular is very protean. It changes all the time, right? And it can always anticipate counter positions, right? And so just when you think you've overcome power, right?
Hey, we elected Obama.
Right,
we got an African-American president. We fixed racism. Hooray!
Right. So if
guess what?
If our horizon of vision only extends into the next sort of election cycle, we can be sure, okay, you might win that next election cycle, but what about after that, right? There's another great analogy of we can be warriors and storm the castle, and then we get into the evil castle and we're into the control room, and then we recognize that the people who are in control have gone, right? They're not there. In fact, there is no control room in the castle, right? Because power is so sort of protean and the word I'm looking for is amorphous, I think, right? It's hard for us with our our finite human understanding to figure out how to sort of topple all of these evils. I believe, however, that within the framework of the revelation of Baha'u'llah, we have that one possibility, right? That's why I'm a Baha'i, right? If I didn't believe that, then there's no really reason for me to be a Baha'i. As someone who's committed to changing the world and trying to bring about social transformation, I would choose something else. I would choose another avenue if I didn't believe that Baha'u'llah's revelation had the real answer, and that answer is kind of like pervasive. It involves so many different elements, right? It's not just one thing that we can do. And so for me, again, speaking very individually, I say I join up my sort of efforts to that of the faith because it's kind of like it's global, right? I mean, that's the beautiful thing about the Baha'i Faith, right? Is we're involved in our little, let's say, election of our LSA in our little locality, but on that same day when we're doing that, there's somebody in Papua New Guinea doing that. There's someone in Angola doing that. There's someone in, Taiwan that's doing that.
Suburban Pittsburgh.
And suburban Pittsburgh, right, exactly. We're all involved in this kind of world transformative, history transforming project. And small as we may be at this moment, my faith is that someday, our efforts will contribute to that greater transformation.
I hope so.
So I could say one thing, like,
yeah,
I don't begrudge anyone who devotes themselves to Black Lives Matter or some other sort of socially transformative agenda. However, for myself, right, I try and kind of align these commitments that I have to social justice always with the kind of like the principles and the framework of the Baha'i Faith. At least that's what I aspire to.
Well, I also think that building something is really, really hard. Protesting against something is pretty easy, especially if it's just done on social media. Just like, oh, that's a terrible article. Oh, I can't believe that person said that horrible racist thing. Ah! And even to go out on the streets, and not to say that, look, the history of protestation in our country its link to civil rights is huge and super important. And things wouldn't have changed if we hadn't had that, but it's a lot harder to build something and bring people together and sit on a committee and consult and love people that you disagree with when you're in a room with tea and cookies with them and try and achieve change on a grassroots level. And I think some of this you addressed at a recent panel that you were on, Beyond Resistance, Beyond Critique, Exploring Constructive Agency in Social Movement and Critical Scholarship. That was at the Association of Baha'i Studies. Was that a little bit of the sense of that panel, or can you fill us in a little bit on what you guys discussed there?
Right. I think in that panel, there were various people from various disciplines who were thinking about the concept of constructive resilience, which is one that was advanced by the Universal House of Justice in letters to the Baha'i community in Iran, but which also referenced particularly sort of the African American experience as being one in which social transformation was brought about through this idea of constructing alternatives to contemporary social formations. So rather than adopting a stance of protest or antagonism, which inherently sort of involves conflict and contention, and usually when we're involved in conflict and contention with an enemy, we ultimately sort of take on many of the attributes of the enemy, right? Instead of involving ourselves in that kind of effort to create social change, that Baha'is are engaged in constructing something new, right? Constructing something that has maybe never been seen before. And as you said, that can be a difficult, arduous, time-consuming project.
Thankless.
And it can
it goes on and on.
Requiring so much self-sacrifice. But it's one that it seems like we as Baha'is are trying to engage in, right? We're trying to build our alternatives that are not organized along the lines of, let's say, social transformation movements that we've seen in the past, right? This is we are building a new sort of building, if you will, that people can come into when all the other buildings have burnt down, right? And I think that there's various ways in which we've done that. And so, for example, like in the African American sort of historical experience, much of the communalism that took place around the church and so forth, right? That was a kind of building of an alternative world and social system through which Black people could thrive and survive, in America. One might say that institution has almost run its course, and it's not providing African Americans with the kind of sustenance that it did in the past. But for a lot of American history, this is the alternative structure that was built by Black people in America. In Iran, we see Baha'is who are terribly sort of persecuted in that nation, sort of not orienting themselves toward their persecutors, but more working on building communities that are based upon unity and principles of love and justice and so forth that are sustaining for those who can enter them, And so it moves us away from contention and the resistance model into something that is maybe a little bit more difficult, a little bit more low key, right? A little bit more less flashy, something that doesn't really provide us with opportunities for heroics and grandstanding and a kind of moral righteousness, right? That may be possible if you're involved in like speaking truth to power, right? That's nice. That builds your adrenaline up, right? I'm speaking truth to power. Like, I'm taking the people who are evil and I'm showing them what is truth by speaking my reality, and that's righteous. That's a beautiful thing, right? But there's
Are you saying Baha'is shouldn't speak truth to power?
No, I'm not saying
that line between speaking truth to power and being contentious, or
well, I think that if speaking truth to power is like your only means of sort of advancing something, then that's all you may speak a lot of truth, right? But then what, right? You've got to build something behind that truth, right? And so I think Baha'is are involved in this tandem process, right? I mean, like, we think about history in really sort of narrow terms, right? We think about history in terms of like the icons, right? Like Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, like the people at the front of the protest lines and all that, right? But like without the Southern Christian Leadership Council, there is no Martin Luther King. Without the Nation of Islam, right, there's no Malcolm X, right? There are these vast organizational structures that built things which we don't really think about, right? And I think that in the Baha'i Faith, we're less concerned with the iconography of sort of social transformation than we are with the actual rudiments of building something transformational, right?
And you think about the civil rights movement too. I think about the incredible sacrifice of the people of all different skin colors and backgrounds and being parts of the civil rights movement, that they did it because they believed in it. The selfless service without any glory.
Right. The thankless work that nobody remembers, done by people whose names have been lost to history and so forth, right? Like if we think about the like the bus boycotts and so forth, there was hundreds of black women sort of organizing, making calls to see who was going to take someone here and there. And,
right.
Oftentimes like the work
making lasagna and bringing it to the people at the churches who are marching that day.
Right. It's a lot of times it's the work that women are doing that is, sort of unrecognized and so forth, right? So, I mean, I think that, like the Baha'i sort of approach to social change is more akin to that kind of work, that kind of the not flashy sort of, but the steady sort of building and commitment to ideals.
Yeah. So we have a very limited amount of time, but I would love to hear about the work that you're doing in the prison systems, because it sounds really exciting. And that's an area where Baha'is, I think, could definitely, if they're looking for a way of being of service, like they might be able to go right into doing some of this kind of work.
Mm-hmm. So when I came, I was abroad for some time, and I came back to the U.S. in about 2011, I think. And, I really wanted to sort of integrate my professional life with a kind of work that would be committed to social justice principles that I believed in. And so I thought that engagement with the American prison system would be a good way of doing that. And so what I've done for the past few years since that time in 2011 was, really try to bring what I could into the prison in terms of like my own teaching, right? So for a while when I was in New York, I taught in a lot of facilities throughout New York State. And right now, I'm also teaching here in California.
What do you teach?
Well, I teach usually my areas of specialty, which are African American cultural texts. So, for example, this semester, I'll teach a class on African American autobiography.
What are some of the autobiographies that prisoners respond the most to?
Well, obviously, students on the inside are interested in things like Malcolm X, right? I mean, like, a lot of African-American autobiography sort of takes shape kind of almost like within sort of like the carceral system, right? Like people begin to sort of teach themselves and learn within the prison. I mean, Malcolm X is a great model of that. So, of course, the autobiography of Malcolm X is really, transformative and powerful for people on the inside. I think, Huey Newton's also his autobiography. But then, in my courses, I'm doing a kind of like, I look at these things like in really sort of almost clinical ways, so I'm looking at the 19th century and the development of a tradition which starts with the abolitionist slave narratives, right, as a kind of form of an indigenous American form of autobiography, which sort of Black people kind of came up with in the effort to overturn the institution of slavery, sort of writing their own stories to demonstrate their own humanity. So, look at Frederick Douglass, Harriet Jacobs, and then bring it forth into the 20th century with people like Richard Wright and so forth. That's what I'm doing this semester.
Oh, that's great. So what have you learned from all of your work in the prison system and teaching there, coming back into the United States? And are there ways that Baha'is can get involved?
Well, I think one of the main learnings is that, we have this incredible system of sort of warehousing human beings in really kind of inhumane conditions in America, which has developed over the last, let's say, 40 to 50 years. There's a lot of reasons for that. I think that the willingness to undertake what I think of as a kind of unprecedented historical experiment with human incarceration is really underwritten by ideologies of anti-Blackness and so forth, because we tend to think often about criminal life and as being Black somehow or non-white. That is not sort of maybe perfectly sort of reflected in my experience in the prison. For example, I'm in California now, and there are a great deal of, Latino and people who I'm working with right now. And so one of the things that I would say in terms of my learning is that, there's so much value and human potential that is being squandered and destroyed basically by this institution. And you see inside like so many people who possess all these capacities and these beautiful qualities that we do not associate with kind of like the dark criminal that sort of lurks in the American imagination, right? That there's so much value inside, right?
Yeah.
And so I appreciate my classes in that, I get to work with some of the brightest and the most engaged of some of these people who are locked up. And there's a lot of excitement in the intellectual exchange that occurs, a lot of intelligence, right? There's another idea, right, that these people are not smart or only kind of like smart from,
There's a TV show I've been trying to get off the ground for years called Stand Up at Sing Sing. And we have an in to Sing Sing prison and doing comedy with prisoners.
That's great.
So doing improv, having them work on stand-up sets, bringing special guest stand-up artists out there and doing a presentation at the end. And we just couldn't get anyone to bite on it. We had a great presentation and it didn't happen. And one of the women was that we pitched to at some network, she was very straight. And she said, listen, a lot of people, they think that people in prison are bad and they're evil and they're unredeemable, and people don't want to watch stories about prisoners because they imagine, that's probably a rapist or a murderer or something like that. So,
Or if they do want to see the stories, because there's a lot of prison documentary style thing, right? It's all about like this sort of psychotic, dark,
how dark it is, and prison violence and hierarchies in the prison system. And
when in fact, right, it's the full range of human life which takes place there. And they're like in my classrooms inside. I mean, I've had some of the best laughs ever. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. And so when I talk about prison, obviously there is this dimension of it which is super serious, and it's really destroying, life. But at the same time, within that institution, there's all kinds of comedy, there's humor. And so I love this idea of the humor that can sort of take place inside. So, but we have very, strong preconceptions about, what it is that goes on inside. And I think in terms of your other question about what Baha'is can do or what people can do, right, is, there's so much work that needs to happen around reintegration. Yeah. Thankfully,
so many places simply won't employ someone.
Right.
They have a record.
Yeah, and thankfully we're sort of trying to. There's enough recognition, political will to sort of I think, move in a direction which is lessening the prison population. So more people are coming home, right? But what opportunity do you have when you go home? You know, your life has been totally upended by involvement with the criminal justice system and being incarcerated. So, you know, there are people who need, you know, work, who need opportunities, who need to be given a chance, right? There has to be opportunities for education also for people who want to sort of advance themselves. And I think that those kinds of areas of engagement could be really important for Baha'is. Also, you know, trying to work with kids, you know, before, you know, they are incarcerated, right? You know, trying to work with...
Like the foster care system would be a great way to get involved. It's such a broken system. Would be a great way for Baha'is to be of service.
And also, you know, and again, sort of holding law enforcement accountable, right? I mean, sort of really thinking about the way that we, and these are not easy questions, but thinking about the way that we try to maintain sort of law and order. You know, I mean, we can exert wills in our community, you know, to make sure that certain processes don't happen, which have led to the explosion of this kind of, as I said, social experiment, which is devastating, you know, to our society, I think.
Derik Smith, Dr. Derik Smith, this has been such a profound pleasure speaking with you. I've gained so much knowledge and insight, and I love your perspective. And I'm so excited to share this podcast with the world and for people to get to know your work. Is there other places that people can find where you've written and what you've written? I mean, other than just a Google search?
Yeah, you know, as I said, my work is here and there. You know, I try to put it out on the internet in various places. I'm not like a big internet person. Like, I'm not that guy on Twitter. You know, like I don't even really use social media and so forth. So it's there. I'm working on a book right now on the rapper Rakim, right? Okay. And so the developments in hip hop that occur, you know, through sort of his innovations, I think, in hip hop poetics. I think I'm hopefully in a couple years that book will be out, so you can watch out for that. You know.
Oh, fantastic!
But I really appreciate you having me here. I appreciate that a lot. Right?
Oh, the pleasure is mine. Really, thank you so much. Thanks for your time, and thanks for driving all the way.
Oh no, thanks
to
a lot.
Agoura Hills, California.
My honor.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for listening to Baha'i Blogcast. Hope you enjoyed the episode and the conversation. Check out more fun Baha'i stuff on Baha'iBlog.net. Thank you so much, and good night.